Remember as we start this unit that we've already talked about lots and lots of changes that are going on in the same time period as this unit, in which we're going to talk about absolute monarchs of Europe. You have the scientific revolution, you have the Enlightenment, you also still have the remnants of the Reformation and the Renaissance, you have the Mughal Empire and the Ottoman Empire. All these things are going on all at the same time that absolute monarchs are coming to be in different places all over the world. So before we really get into the unit, I want to make sure that you understand some of the characteristics of absolute monarchies, and we're going to talk about several countries that this happened in. So one of the major characteristics of absolute monarchies is it's just what you see before you. It's a form of government in which all power is vested in that one single ruler. They might have some people give them advice, but everything ultimately is up to them. They don't have to listen to anything that anybody says. So kings and queens secured their position as this supreme ruler and possessor of all power through something called divine right. And somehow they convinced subjects that God selected them to rule. Therefore, to go against them is to go against God. That's divine right, and people were terrified to go against it. God is still a really, really powerful force in their lives, and you don't mess with God. The first absolute ruler that we're going to talk about is Louis XIV of France. And you can see here on the screen that he ruled for 72 years. Very vain guy. L'état moi, I am the state, basically meant I am France, and once I'm gone, France will no longer exist because I'm that great. And he called himself the Sun King, that, he shone as bright as the sun. He really thought a lot of himself. Louis XIV was actually kind of feminine. He brought fashion to France. He loved high heels, especially red ones. Had a closet full of wigs and hats and dresses. But he did do some good things and some bad things. So let's kind of make a list here. He built this huge palace called the Palace of Versailles as a symbol of his power. And we're going to talk about the Palace of Versailles quite a bit in other units. It's going to be used often throughout time for dignitaries to get together to decide the outcomes of things like World War I. So the Palace of Versailles actually started out as a hunting lodge, and then Louis turned it into a beautiful castle, and I'll show you pictures of that in just a minute. One of the more evil things that he did is he canceled that Edict of Nantes. Remember we talked about the Huguenots who were French Calvinists, and through the edict they were given the freedom of religion and nobody would persecute them anymore. Louis canceled that edict and had as many murdered as he could, and those that of course survived were fleeing for their lives out of France. He felt that in order for his country to be unified, he had to get rid of those Huguenots, and he did some pretty bad things to them. But he did make the French army the strongest in Europe. He was very good at strategizing things like that. And under him, he spent lots and lots and lots of money, but he was really good at floating the economy so that he made lots of deals with foreign dignitaries and at all levels, and just always seemed to make a profit at everything he did. So even though his bills just for his wardrobe were astronomical, he knew how to make money and really kept France doing very, very well. So if you click to the next page, I'll show you what I mean by the money that he spent. This is the Palace of Versailles. It is acres and acres and acres. You could get lost in the house very easily. There's over 200 bathrooms in it. It is just a unbelievable architectural miracle, really, for its time period especially. The gardens go on for miles and miles and miles. Stone walls that go on, same amount, just beautiful. If you keep clicking, you'll see more pictures. Here's one of the interior alcoves, and yeah, you can go today. You can be a tourist. This over here on the far left is one of the entranceways, and then there's this winding staircase to look down. This was a big meeting place because you could put people on two levels, and the king would sit on the bottom level and his voice would reverberate to the upper level and everyone will be able to hear him. Up at the top is just one of the very, very gaudy, ornate water fountains that are all over the place on the territory or the land that belongs to Versailles. And then down at the bottom on the right hand side is something called the Hall of Mirrors, and everything in there reflects light. It's probably one of the most beautiful rooms on the planet, but it is very gaudy, very ornate. He was all about making the world think that he was the best at everything and impressing everybody, and he did. He was good at that too.
By the summer of 1715, Louis had injured his leg. We're not really sure exactly what happened. Some say that he simply ran into a piece of furniture and cut his leg. Others say he was bit by a dog. But Louis was a workaholic, and he loved to be in front of people, and he was not going to take the time to have it checked. Um, it got worse over the summer of 1715, and Louis still refused to go to the doctor about it. And by September of that year, Louis was dead. Now, back then, you didn't just bury a king. A king had to be divided into three separate parts in France. And so the doctors came in and they opened him up and they took his heart out and they took his entrails out. And so now he's going to have three burial places, one for his body, one for his heart, and one for his entrails. That is in case the crowds get too big to go and mourn at the graveside of the king. You have three separate places for them to go mourn. Of course, people wanted to see the king and say goodbye to him. So rather than have his real body, which after a few days is going to start to smell pretty ripe, they made wax images of the king and sat him up in the king's bed even, and you could come in and say goodbye to the wax figure of the king. They took him from little village to little village as long as it wasn't too hot because he was wax. And they allow people to come and pay homage to the wax figure that way. So, but the sad fact is that Louis passed, and with the passing of Louis, France is going to find itself in a lot of debt. And we will talk more about that in another unit. But that is King Louis.
The next leader we're going to talk about is Peter the Great of Russia. And you can see that he also served his country for a very, very long time. Peter the Great was really big on westernizing and modernizing his country. He wanted to be like the greatest powers on the planet, and he did some crazy, crazy, crazy things. One of the things that he did is he fell in love very, very early in his life with sailing. And he really probably just would have been a sailor and nothing else if people had let him. But he was given the title of king, and he felt that he had to fulfill that duty to honor his father's name, if nothing else. He also only had one brother, and this brother had a lot of mental disabilities. He had the mental capacity of maybe a 5-year-old. And he actually loved his brother a lot, and he felt that he had to remain king to protect him because he felt like if he fell out of power, then his brother would probably bad things would have happened to him. He couldn't take care of himself. So Peter becomes a sailor for a while with the goal that he would travel west in disguise, and he would learn all about westernized techniques for everything, military, culture, everything you can think of. And when he came home from all these trips, whatever new thing he had learned, he would make his people learn. It used to be kind of a society habit that men, for some reason, wore their sleeves really, really, really long, like they covered up their hands. And he invited a bunch of higher nobles to dinner one night, and at the dinner table, he went around the table and cut all their sleeves off, and told them if he ever saw their sleeves covering their hands again, he would cut their hands off. He also practiced dentistry himself. So if you complained of a toothache, he would just get a pair of pliers and pull it out. He had learned in the Western world that you didn't have to die of poison produced from a toothache, which happened quite a bit in this time period. You could just rip it out, and he was more than happy to be the guy to do it. He also made his men shave. And it was to the point where if he saw a male on the street who had a long beard, I think he just kept scissors on him at all times because he would walk up to the guy and cut his beard off and threaten him with death if he did not go home and finish the job. So Peter worked really hard to modernize and westernize Russia, and he succeeded in doing so pretty well. If you click to the next page, you'll see some of the architecture that he endeavored in. This is St. Petersburg, and it's on the eastern side of Russia. So he actually stole all the stonemakers from, I'm sorry, it's in the western side. It's very late. It's the western side of Russia, and he actually stole the stonemakers from the eastern side of Russia and brought them all over to St. Petersburg. So the east coast kind of went without anything new for a very long time while they were making St. Petersburg. And you can see the similarities between this building and the building at Versailles with the golden figures and the water fountains that are very gaudy. He wanted to be like the Western people. But again, he succeeded in doing everything that he set out to do. He did definitely westernize his country, and those who followed him followed suit. He did rule his people with an iron fist. You did not doubt a word that he said, or he would slit your throat right in front of everybody else. He had no problem with that. Pretty nasty guy sometimes, but he definitely led Russia to good things economically, through the military as well, increased his military power, did good things for Russia overall on that kind of scale. I know we're going through these really quick, um, but there's not tons of details that you need to know about all these guys. I just want you to understand what absolutism is. England's going to be the one we're really going to focus on because they're the ones that you can really see the pattern where they emerge out of absolutism and into constitutional government. So I'm kind of rushing through the rest of them. But the last one we're going to talk about before we talk about England is Frederick the Great of Prussia. And if you look at the map here, you can see that Prussia will eventually become part of Germany. They consider themselves German people, very much like the people who live in Germany themselves. Lots of people in this area consider themselves German. It's a very old tribe, actually. And so Prussia has nothing to do with Russia. They are actually German. And it is Frederick the Great of Prussia who's going to really do great things to make Prussia a military might, and eventually it's going to spread into Germany as well. So let me give you a little bit of background history on uh, poor Frederick here. He's actually Frederick II. Frederick I was his grandfather, and if you remember the story of the Crusades, Frederick Barbarossa was on his way to fight the Muslims at 70 some years old. He was much older, late 70s, and he was such a mean, nasty guy that he fell overboard and no one would save him. They let him drown. That's what his grandfather was like. His father was even worse. His father, he wanted Frederick to be this great military guy, like his own father had been. He wanted his son to be that. But Frederick wasn't like that. Frederick was a poet and a flutist and enjoyed just educated conversation and reading great books, and he just was not this military guy, and his dad hated that. He locked him in the closet quite often. He did some pretty nasty things to his son to try and toughen him up, and one of the ones that really sticks out in my head is Frederick had a very good friend. They had been together for several years, best friends for several years, and his father invited this young man over to have dinner with the family one night, a very formal occasion, and they had dinner and they had a good time and they laughed and they joked, and at the end of the meal, Frederick's father walked over to this friend of Frederick's and chopped his head off right in front of Frederick and would not let him cry. Told him he was not allowed to cry or he was going to have the same thing happen to him. And he really thought in his own twisted way that this was going to make Frederick be a great military mind. Frederick wasn't into being military, but he was very smart. So once he was pushed into that military position, he was very good at it. He was very good at a job that he hated. And he does actually lead Prussia into this huge force to be reckoned with. I really don't know if his dad doing the terrible things he did had anything to do with it, but he ended up being a great leader.
So now we're going to leave these absolute leaders from all over the world, and looking at the just the craziest ones, and we're going to go spend some time in England. So we're going to figure out how they went from an absolute rule to a constitutionally controlled country like they are today. We have to start with Charles the First. Charles the First was he had a reputation of having multiple personalities. Now, was that true? Who knows? But according to everything people wrote about him, you never knew which Charles you were going to get. One day you would meet him and he was sweet and wonderful and kind, and the next day he was just this evil, awful, vengeful person. So you just never knew how he was going to react to you individually. It was always a surprise. So Charles didn't just individually upset people, he upset the country itself. And one of the things that he was really adamant about was the fact that he did not want to share power with Parliament because he was, in his mind, an absolute leader. So he did not want to share power with them, and he ends up dissolving Parliament. That is a big, big no in England. They question his power, and so he dissolved them. So that's offense number one against Charles. He ran up a huge debt, and he tried to correct that debt by overtaxing people. And maybe it wouldn't have been so bad if the debt was something worthwhile, but it was for Charles's own personal debt because he loved to live in luxury and give his wife the most beautiful clothes, and so he ran up a personal debt and then tried to make England pay for it by overtaxing them. He also put people into prison without trial, and you can't do that in England in this time period. And so the people of England are going to get really upset with this guy, and they decide that they're going to do something about it. Now, we have to remember that Charles saw himself as an absolute leader, and he was not the only person anywhere that believed in the idea of divine right and absolute rule. So it was really hard for people to accept the fact that they could actually go against their king. But there is going to be one guy who says, this is what we're going to do, and we are going to go against the king. And he actually is a parliament member. He's been dissolved, and he stands up and says, we're not going to put up with this. And this man's name was Oliver Cromwell. So Oliver Cromwell convinced the members of parliament that, remember, they've been dissolved, but he convinces them that they need to go against their king. Well, of course, not everyone is going to be okay with this, and so there's going to be a civil war. And the Civil War is all about, should you get rid of Charles, or at least put him to the side for a little while, or should we just follow all the crazy things that he's doing without question? So the Civil War is all over Charles the First. So after 7 years, the Civil War will end with the imprisonment of Charles I, and he is going to end up being tried for treason for all the reasons that I gave you before. So 135 men were ordered to be part of the jury, but only 68 were brave enough to show up that day. They didn't know how to try a king. It had never been done before, and nobody really understood the correct procedure. And what if the king goes free? Is he going to come back and get all these men that were part of the jury and do bad things to them or their family? So people were afraid. At the trial, Charles was very odd too. Charles would not defend himself. He wouldn't even speak. He kept his hat on and his head down so you couldn't see his face. And so he did nothing really to help himself. And in the end, he will be found guilty. Now, the official sentence is he was found guilty as a tyrant, a traitor, a murderer, and public enemy to the good of his nation. And it said that he shall be put to death by the severing of his head from his body. Pretty drastic stuff. So he is sentenced to die by having his head chopped off. So January 30th arrives, 1649, really cold day. Charles, again, he's still the king, and they're not really sure how to do this. So they go to his prison cell and ask him if he would like to have a last wish. And he said, yes, I would like a private moment with my dog to say goodbye. And so he was allowed to take an escorted walk, escorted with guards, with his dog for one last time. He was also given the ability to request any food that he wanted for his last meal, and we still do that today. Charles was the first one. Today, if you're on death row, hopefully none of us will be, but if you are on death row, then you're allowed to pick the last meal that you eat. And so Charles was the first one that was given that luxury because he was the king, and the last meal he picked was a meal of bread and wine. Not even a cheeseburger. I mean, I would have went with cheeseburger, but no, he wanted bread and wine. Remember, it's January, and it was a very cold January. So the men who were going to carry out the execution talked about this, and they were worried that it was so cold that when Charles went up onto the gallows to have his head cut off, that he would be shivering from the cold. And as king, and maybe God on earth, or at least chosen by God, it wouldn't look good if he was shaking from fear. And so, in order to save him his last few remnants of self respect, they layered him in clothing so that he would be warm and would not shake when he walked up to the gallows. Now, I'm going to show you a little video clip in a minute so you can see what actually happened at his beheading before, during, and after. He even at the beheading, when he walked up to the gallows, he was very quiet, very almost like he wanted people to forgive him for the things that he had done, like he was guilty. He's almost peaceful in a sense. And this video I'm going to show you is actually considered to be pretty accurate according to what happened. So you'll see how he is just this defeated figure, and you will see what the people say about him. They want to touch him because a lot of them still believe that he was handpicked by God, so this makes him holy. You're going to see Oliver Cromwell try to argue with the crowd that he was not godlike, that he was nothing more than a man. But you'll see all this in the video. What you don't see in the video is afterwards, after in real life, after the hanging, or I'm sorry, after the head chopping, people are allowed to come up onto the gallows and dip a piece of material, or cloth, in the blood of Charles because it's considered holy. So people did do that, and again, that is an indication that they really did think that he had divine right. At least some people really did believe that. So let's take a look at the video.
I have a good cause and a gracious God. I will say no more. I go from a corruptible to an incorruptible crown. And no disturbance can be, none at all. Remember, Wait my sign.
Red. It is red blood, like our own. He was God on earth! He was your prisoner, your enemy. A man who killed your brothers for gold, have you forgotten? With this you are subjects no more, but citizens, free men. You do not have to kneel to any other man. You are your own masters, commanding your own fate.
So Charles is dead, and England's got to decide who is now going to rule their country. And they're not real sure that they want a king. If they picked a king, it would more than likely have to be a relative of the man they just murdered, and that might not be a good idea. And do they want a king? Do they want somebody else that might convince the people of absolute power? And so it was decided that Oliver Cromwell would lead England. Now, he was not called a king. He didn't want to be called a king. They just considered him the leader. I'm not really sure what they called him. I've seen different terms, but nothing really solid what he was really called. But he ruled as a military dictator, and that went on, as you can see, for 11 years. And at the end of 11 years, Oliver Cromwell died a natural death. So he was not murdered. But while he was controlling England, he really pushed his Puritan views on England, and really sent England into some chaos. He exiled all the Catholics to Ireland. That's why Ireland is so Catholic even today. He's the reason. He kicked out anybody that was not willing to listen to his Puritan ideas. He kicked them all out and sent them to Ireland. And he put Puritan laws in force. For one thing, Sunday was only for worship. You were not allowed to do anything else. No dancing, no theaters, no going to the taverns, of course, especially on Sunday. And eventually he actually closed down the places, completely closed them down 7 days a week, not just Sunday, because Puritans thought that those forms of entertainment, like the dancing in theaters and taverns where you drink, were sinful. And so as the leader, he got rid of all of that. He actually followed Catholics into Ireland and tried to enforce some of these rules there, and ended up destroying any place that these guys might worship their Catholic beliefs, dance, theaters. So he even did these things in Ireland. It wasn't just in England. So again, he it is very militaristic, and it's not going to end until he dies of natural causes in 1658. Now Oliver is dead, and once again, England is going to have to figure out how to pick a new leader. So they don't want military rule again, and they've decided that the lesser of the evils that they know is to have a monarchy. And so they select the son of Charles I, the guy that they killed. They select his son to fill the crown. And he is known as the Restoration King, because by allowing Charles II, the son of Charles I, to take the crown, he is restoring the crown, the rightful crown. So he becomes known as the Restoration King. There's a second reason he's known as that, and I want you to know both. During the time of Oliver Cromwell, any kind of colonization done by England was completely done away with. He did not believe in taking over foreign lands. I'm not going to say that he was a wonderful guy and was trying to save the indigenous people from, the evils of foreign takeover. He claimed that's what it was, and maybe it was, but he just thought that colonization shouldn't happen. And so he wouldn't allow any new colonies in America to be officially turned into a colony, even though areas like the Carolinas were asking, please, please, please make us an official colony. Oliver Cromwell said no. Well, under Charles II, he thought that was fantastic, because they'll name things after me if I'm the king that allows them to have a real official colonial charter. And so Charles II restores the idea of colonization here in America, and so he's called the Restoration King for that as well. So he restored the crown, and he restored colonization. Now under Charles II, political factions are going to develop, and mostly it's because some of them wanted to be more of the old Oliver Cromwell type of ways, and some of them said no, we like the new Charles ways. And so you have these political factions that for the very first time are forming in Parliament, and because of that, England is actually becoming more democratic. This isn't a bad thing; it's a good thing. So people will have choices. In 1685, Charles II is going to die, and he's going to die of natural causes. And the very, very, very Catholic James II, his brother, becomes king. English Protestants really feared the prospect of a line of Catholic kings. So Parliament is really, really worried that there's going to be another war, and they don't want that. It hasn't been that long since they had the Civil War over what to do with Charles. So Parliament went to James II and said, you have a choice here. You can either leave the country peacefully and quietly, or we can kill you. And so the legend is that he actually dressed up like a woman and took his most valued possessions, tied them on the inner linings of his dress, because he's dressed like a woman, and he ran out of town and no one ever saw him again. So who knows if that's true, but it's an interesting story, right? So now Parliament's got to find somebody else to put in his place, but they already had a plan. They invited his Protestant daughter, she's Protestant, Mary, and her husband William to overthrow, and you can't see me, but I'm doing air quotes here, overthrow James for the sake of being a Protestant. Mary and William were good Protestants. And so this bloodless overthrow of King James II is known as the Glorious Revolution. Sometimes it is known as the Bloodless Revolution, but most often it's Glorious Revolution because nobody died. It was a revolution because the authority of the country changed, but there was no blood involved, nobody got hurt, and so it is known as the Glorious Revolution or the Bloodless Revolution. And again, they are well on their way to being a more democratic nation. Now, William and Mary were not going to be allowed to just rule. They wanted Parliament. When I say they, I mean Parliament. Parliament wanted things to be different. And William and Mary were asked to recognize Parliament as their partner in governing the nation of England. A constitutional monarchy was established, which just basically means that they wrote a constitution, and in that constitution, the laws limited the power of William and Mary and every king and queen that came after them. So no longer will they accept the idea of an absolute ruler. They can't do things without the permission of Parliament, and it starts with William and Mary, and it has never ended. And to make it completely official, William and Mary, before they were allowed to really legally be the king and queen of England, they had to sign the English Bill of Rights in 1689. And again, that is to officially, legally limit the power of the ruling force in England and to protect the rights of all Englishmen. So after 1688, no British monarch could rule without the consent of Parliament. That's just the way it was from then till now. And now I can only think of one time that the current Queen Elizabeth, who has been in power for a really, really long time, was asked to do something. And that was just several years ago. There was a tie in Parliament that they just could not get past. They couldn't figure out a way to break it. And so Queen Elizabeth was asked to come to Parliament's chambers and break the tie. But other than that, the British Crown is really truly just a face. They make lots of money for England. People come to see them, ride by in their carriages and watch the changing of the guards, and they make a lot of money off of it. But the royal family really doesn't have very much power anymore. And that starts all the way back in 1688 with the idea of the Bill of Rights, and then its fruition in 1689. And the very last thing, just as kind of a review to pull it all together for the rulers of England, there was a prior contract before the English Bill of Rights that was signed between the nobles and the king that limited the power of the king for the very, very first time. And this was before the idea of absolutism. And if here's a hint, it was King John King John was the one who had to sign it because he was doing really bad things, gambling with the country's safety. And so, can you guess it? I hope you did. If you didn't, it's the Magna Carta. So, the Magna Carta will come first with King John, and then the next really efficient document that we still use today in England was the English Bill of Rights. But make sure you know that the Magna Carta came first. It was the first attempt to limit the power of the monarch. It just kind of, the power of it kind of went away after a while with this idea of divine right. And so the Parliament decided that they would not allow this new law to go away, and made them actually sign the English Bill of Rights that says English men and women have specific rights, not just limiting the power of royalty, but to give specific rights. Much more powerful document. So the Magna Carta limited the power of the king, but didn't give the people rights. This new English Bill of Rights will do both, and so it is much more powerful because the people of England are vested in it, and so they still use the Bill of Rights today, even though the Magna Carta is super famous. They're not living under that anymore. They're living under the English Bill of Rights. All right, so that is it in a nutshell. That's the unit on absolutism. See you in the next unit. Hope you do great on the test.